Good morning and welcome to Rising. I'm Amber Duke and I am excited to be joined remotely this Friday by the one and only Jessica Burbank.
It's good to be on with you. Everything's fine, Amber. That's what I've found.
Yeah, everything is fine, I say as I sip my coffee in my house on fire. What's up first on the docket for us today?
Well, yesterday, President Biden issued a final defense on Israel's siege of Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza and reaffirmed why he won't be calling for a ceasefire in the region. Let's watch.
The first war crime is being committed by Hamas by having their headquarters, their military, hidden under a hospital. And that's a fact. That's what's happened. Israel did not go in with large number of troops, did not raid, did not rush everything down. They've gone in, and they've gone in with their soldiers carrying weapons or guns. They were told, let me be precise. We've discussed the need for them to be incredibly careful. You have a circumstance where you know there is a fair number of Hamas terrorists. Hamas has already said publicly that they plan on attacking Israel again, like they did before, do everything cutting babies' heads off to burning women and children alive. And so the idea that they're going to just stop and not do anything is not realistic. This is not the carpet bombing. This is a different thing.
This morning, the director of Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza told Al Jazeera today that 22 ICU patients died overnight, including all those who were in the intensive care unit. There are 7,000 people still in the hospital. However, dead bodies are piling up. The morgue is full, and there are no refrigerator trucks. The director also disputed the claim that Israel provided incubators and said the hospital already has incubators, but they need fuel for generators to power them. He said the hospital has become a, quote, big prison.
The LA Times editorial board and other reporters who signed an open letter criticizing Israel and calling for a ceasefire have been banned from writing about the conflict for 3 months. Meanwhile, activists on both coasts shut down the Bay and Boston bridges yesterday with their demands for a ceasefire. So, Jessica, with Biden's statement there, I imagine that the progressive base of the Democratic Party is not happy, especially considering the recent pro-Palestinian protests that found its way to the White House a couple of weekends ago. Biden doesn't seem to be backing down from his support of Israel at all.
Not backing down whatsoever. To say that the first war crime is Hamas having a base at a hospital is absurd. The first war crime, without a doubt, is to collectively punish a population of people living in Gaza, 2.3 million people living in a city that's the size of about Manhattan, to remove their access to electricity, food, and water. This is the first war crime committed by Israel. To say that Hamas has a base in the hospital and that U.S. intelligence confirms this is an absurd thing to do. When you have Hamas saying we absolutely do not have a base, there are no tunnels under the hospital, this is absurd to claim this, and they're only costing more innocent human lives by taking siege of this hospital. They actually invited independent investigators from the United Nations and other international bodies to come in and confirm this. The United States has not responded to that claim. If it is true that there is a Hamas base there, they should invite these independent investigators in to confirm this for the international community, because it's been heavily disputed. And I think even if there was a base in the hospital, many people would not find this justification. To allow 7,000 people in the hospital to die. We have special forces for circumstances like this, where there would be secret tunnels under a hospital. For them to use this tactic of taking siege of the hospital and removing innocent civilians from the care that they need, it's absolutely absurd. That is a war crime in itself. One war crime doesn't justify another, even if Biden's logic were true.
Yeah, I think a lot of people were quick to believe this just because Hamas has a history of using hospitals and schools as bases for headquarters. But to your point, there isn't a clear piece of evidence that proves that this particular hospital was being used in that manner. And so far, it seems the IDF has allowed journalists from Fox News and BBC to embed with them. And as they continue their excavation mission, essentially trying to find this underground headquarters. And thus far, neither outlet has been able to confirm that it exists. The most I've seen is from a Fox News reporter He took a picture of what he said was an underground tunnel, but others are disputing that by saying that it's simply an air duct. And then the BBC has pointed out that there are some competing claims as to whether or not there was a headquarters underneath this particular hospital. So that's incredibly problematic, and I think speaks to, as well, the larger problem of misinformation, which is a term I don't like to use because of its associations with what the Biden administration does to crack down on speech, but legitimate misinformation coming out of this war, and how important it is for us to make sure that we're getting accurate information before passing it along when it could potentially be propaganda.
Yeah, and you had Biden again repeating this beheaded babies rumor that was unfounded. There's still no evidence that Hamas was beheading babies, and the confirmed deaths that were babies on the day of October 7th was actually way less than 40. By some reports it's 1, by some reports it's as few as 2, 3. To say that there were 40 beheaded babies and to paint that picture is very intentional wartime propaganda. For Biden to still be repeating it today after there was a media circus around the fact that there was no evidence to this claim is pretty absurd, and it goes to show how dedicated this administration is to pushing this pro-Israel propaganda. It's a time where people have access to this information from other international news sources. People can listen in to what Hamas leaders are saying. People can listen in to what Human Rights Watch is saying. We have Doctors Without Borders doing interviews on CNN. And we also have members of the Israeli military doing interviews on CNN without much pushback from reporters. You have reporters simply politely nodding back as Israel makes the case for carpet bombing Gaza. To say that that's not happening is another absurd claim. In Biden's speech, they dropped 6,000 bombs and 4,000 tons of munition. There's no other description for that. If he's saying, well, now it's a ground campaign, sure, but carpet bombing absolutely did happen. That's how over 11,000 Palestinians have been killed thus far. And so Biden really is up against the realities in people's lives not matching up with the propaganda he's pushing. And I think that's why he's losing a lot of support in the polls right now. And I think that's why a lot of dedicated Democrats are now questioning their support of Joe Biden, because to just give your unavowed support or your vowed support to a regime like Israel that is committing war crimes, when you have people like Jimmy Carter, who was supportive of Israel, extremely critical of Netanyahu. We have examples of former Democratic presidents that have exemplified what it means to really be just when it comes to international affairs and assessing a conflict as tense as this. But Biden has taken the route of just giving support to Israel without questioning Israel's war crimes. And that, in its heart of hearts, could cost him the election in 2024. Enough people are paying attention to this, especially young people who delivered him the presidency are paying attention to this. And they're not down with the wartime propaganda anymore. It's just not working like it used to.
Yeah, I just want to point out that the misinformation doesn't just come from Israel, though. I mean, there is still that dispute over what happened to the hospital in Gaza that the Hamas claimed was bombed by the IDF. And then an independent investigation from the New York Times found that more likely than not, this was the result of a misfired rocket from Hamas. So this is something that happens in wartime on both sides, not just from Israel. And I just wanted to point that out. I also wanted to get your take on the LA Times editorial board and reporters who were banned from covering the conflict after signing this letter criticizing Israel. I had no problem with this. I feel like if you want to give your opinion on the conflict, then you're free to do that. But at that point, you can't be trusted as a neutral party when reporting on the issue, especially given, again, how much misinformation is coming out of both sides here. I think it really damages the ability of people to trust them if they are coming out in support or in opposition to one side of the conflict.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of information coming from both sides, Hamas and Israel, that needs to be questioned because things are in flux in a time of war. In the case of the hospital, most recently, the New York Times posted an update that they reviewed the Al Jazeera live feed of Gaza, of northern Gaza on that evening, and assessed the rocket fire being shared back and forth, and said that it's unclear where the bombing of that hospital, the hospital that became central in news, where it came from, the Al-Ahli hospital. you had the bombing happen on an evening where there was rocket fire being shot down by the Iron Dome. And if you track it, you can see that the rocket that was fired in northern Gaza in the proximity of the hospital was actually shot down by the Iron Dome minutes later. New York Times reviewed this and said, you know, the jury's out. We don't really know what happened, but most recently said that it seems to be an Israeli shell. And so the subsequent updates from the New York Times are not what makes headlines. What makes headlines is the initial reporting that, you know, it was a Hamas rocket that misfired. So I think the New York Times has their fair share of pro-Israel bias. And in the case of the LA Times, when you have a genocide, you've so many times reporters say things along the lines of, my job is to not be a parrot of both sides, a parrot of what the Israeli regime is saying and a parrot of what Hamas is saying, but to listen to both sides and assess what the truth is. And I think there's a duty in times of war crimes, in times of really intense conflict, and especially genocide, to actually call it what it is when it comes to international laws being applied. And it's a tough journalistic duty, but I don't really see it as a bias to apply your values and apply international doctrines to your reporting. And I think that's what the LA Times reporters have done there.
The latest New York Times article that I saw was one in which they said that the full picture does suggest that the most likely story was that the Hamas rocket was responsible for the hospital explosion. And that was from about a week ago, or 2 weeks ago. So I'm not sure which one you're talking about, if there's one that's more recent. But this was from David Lenhart, who wrote his newsletter on revisiting the Gaza hospital explosion and looking at all the available evidence, including that video surveillance that you mentioned. So I'm curious about that, but we're going to have to leave it there. We'll be back with more Rising after this.